Hello everyone, I'm Sally Kinney and welcome to the second half of Season 2 of Deconstructing Rape, the podcast for academics, survivors, and activists seeking to understand and mobilize to prevent sexual violence. In Season 1, I spoke with survivor scholars about their experiences of sexual violence and their research findings. In Season 2, I talked with scholar activists about public policies to hold perpetrators of sexual violence accountable, erode rape culture, prevent sexual violence, and help survivors heal. Each episode contains sexually explicit content and adult language. Use discretion when listening. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second half of Season 2 of Deconstructing Rape. Today, I talk with Professor Cassia Spohn, a political scientist and longtime leader in the field of feminist criminology. Her outstanding and painstaking empirical work has profoundly affected our understanding of the anti-rape movement, rape law reform, and how police and prosecutors handle, or should I say regularly mishandle, complaints of sexual assault. She received her BA in journalism and political science from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and then her MA and PhD from that same institution where she also began her teaching career. She became an assistant and then associate professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha and visited at the University of Durham in England. After earning promotion to full professor, she served first as director of the graduate program and then as vice chair and ultimately chair of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. In 2006, she moved to Arizona State University, where she served as director of the graduate program and then director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. In 2014, she became a Foundation Professor and from 2020 received the institution's highest honor of Regents Professor. Throughout this time, Dr. Spohn has written or co-authored 8 books, several in multiple editions, many scholarly articles and reports, tackling the difficult issues of racism, drugs, and sentencing in criminal courts. She has received significant research funding on topics ranging from race and peremptory challenges to specialized prosecution units to reentry programs. Most important for this podcast are her 1992 book, co-authored with Julia Horney, entitled Rape Law Reform, a Grassroots Movement and Its Impact, and her 2014 book, co-authored with Catherine Tellis, Policing and Prosecuting Sexual Assault Inside the Criminal Justice System, which reports research funded by the National Institute of Justice and featured in the documentary film I Am Evidence, which I showed in my class on rape. I also taught her brilliant 2020 article, Sexual Assault Case Processing, The More Things Change, the More They Stay the Same, in the International Journal for Crime, Justice, and Social Democracy. She has received many awards, including teaching awards. Of special note are the Unsung Hero Award for her work on gender and race and the W.E.B. Du Bois Award. She is Fellow of the American Society of Criminology, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and the Western Society of Criminology. In 2017, she was appointed to the Department of Defense Advisory Board on Investigation, Prosecution, and Defense of Sexual Assault in the Armed Forces. She is currently serving on a National Academy of Sciences panel investigating the response to a sexual assault at sea by the U.S. Coast Guard. Cassia Spohn, let's dive right in. I have a lot of questions for you. In your research, you uncover many aspects of what we might label rape exceptionalism. That is, how the criminal justice system treats rapes differently from other crimes such as murder, robbery, or assault. And like sociologists Patricia Yancey Martin and psychologist Rebecca Campbell and many others, you've documented not just how the police fail to believe victims and investigate, but how they also violate their own police procedures by unfounding cases and clearing them by exceptional means when they've made no arrest. You also document how they use the higher standard of beyond a reasonable doubt rather than the standard of probable cause to proceed with an arrest. What is especially pernicious about your findings is that you demonstrate how police will defer to prosecutors in determining whether or not they should move forward with an arrest and continue investigating. And prosecutors then in turn blame jurors, whom they claim will not convict if the perpetrator is an acquaintance, if the victim has used drugs or alcohol or failed to report instantaneously, or gave inconsistent testimony. So how do we in the anti-rape movement exert pressure on a process when each institution is pointing its finger at the others?
Well, I would not necessarily characterize it as a situation in which each institution blames the other. More appropriate, I think, is to use Lisa Froman's notion of a downstream orientation. She documented in her work how sexual assault prosecutors were constantly assessing their cases using a downstream orientation to judges and jurors, who would eventually decide whether to convict the defendant or not. She showed how this orientation led them to reject charges even when they believed that a sexual assault had occurred. They would not file charges if they thought that the case would be evaluated negatively by the judge or jurors. Similarly, Kate Tellis and I found that in Los Angeles, police decisions to arrest were affected by their expectations of whether prosecutors would file charges against the defendant. If they had probable cause to make an arrest, but thought that there were problems with the case, they would send it to the DA for a pre-arrest charging decision. And if the prosecutor said that they would not file charges, the police, the police would not make an arrest, even though there was sufficient evidence to do so, but would clear the case by exceptional means. In essence, the police were ceding their power to make an arrest to the prosecutors. I think that this illustrates the ways in which rape myths, or what Froman refers to as typifications of rape and typifications of rape victim behavior, are entangled with and influence perceptions of probable cause and proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, these are not simply legal assessments of the amount and quality of the evidence needed to make an arrest or to prosecute. And I think this is obviously problematic.
So how do we go about challenging that? You've been working on this for a long time. What is the best way to change the behavior of all three institutions?
Well, that's a difficult question because in my own research, I've revealed that the police do cooperate with the prosecutors in making arrest and charging decisions, and clearly there are rape myths that influence these decisions. And as I've said often, you can change the law, but you can't necessarily change the hearts and minds of those who are making the decision.
But it seems like what you found was, again, an exception in the rape case, that they weren't necessarily ceding their power to the DA in other cases. So what's so special about this case?
I think that, sexual assault cases raise a number of unique issues that other kinds of cases don't raise. It's a case that typically only involves the victim's allegations or the survivor's allegations against the perpetrator. And very often, if the victim doesn't report the crime immediately to the police, there will be little, if any, evidence other than the victim's word that she was sexually assaulted. And there are very few other crimes that have this sort of constellation of characteristics. We also know that there are pervasive myths about sexual assault and sexual assault victims that unfortunately influence how these cases are handled, whether an arrest will be made, whether the case will even be investigated, and then whether the case will be successfully prosecuted. If prosecutors are not filing charges because they believe that jurors in particular have this panoply of rape myths that will preclude them from convicting in a case in which, for example, the victim was dressed provocatively or was using illegal drugs or drinking alcohol or was in a place where she probably should not have been. Then, you know, these are just very different cases than armed robbery or drug trafficking, fraud. I mean, none of those cases have this particular constellation of characteristics.
Thanks. Well, in your extensive interviews that you did in LA and other places, you reveal a small minority of dedicated officers within the criminal justice system who start by believing, who understand trauma, who use arrest when probable cause exists, and understand how to go about building a case. So one of the most significant policy recommendations that you made is for police to create specialized, highly trained sexual assault units who not only reject the rape myths that you've just described, but understand how to overcome them in others, such as judges and juries. But recent evidence in New Orleans and the testimony of our last guest talking about her experience in Boston both reinforce the findings of the Department of Justice report that such units may be necessary but not sufficient because they're often understaffed, poorly resourced, and poorly trained. So how do we mobilize to put pressure on these units so that they can actually perform the function that you describe?
Yeah, although I do advocate for specialized sexual assault units, at least in larger jurisdictions where their existence is practical, I also recognize that these units will not necessarily produce better results. In fact, there is some evidence comparing outcomes in jurisdictions with and without specialized units that indicates that case outcomes do not differ significantly between these types of jurisdictions. And I recently evaluated a specialized sex crimes unit in a major metropolitan police department. And I discovered that the unit was understaffed and under-resourced. And as a result, the sergeant in charge of the unit was actually not even assigning cases to detectives for investigation. They were concentrating on cases involving child victims, and many of the cases involving adult victims were simply not being assigned for investigation. So even though there was a specialized sex crimes unit, it was not adequately staffed. It did not have the resources it needed to handle both child and adult cases, and the result was, not what one would predict. Perhaps the problem is that many police departments and prosecutors' offices do not see sexual assault as a high priority, at least not to the same extent as homicide, armed robbery, kidnapping, or even drug trafficking cases. The rape reform movement emphasized that rape was a crime of violence, not a crime of sex, and as such should be a high priority and should result in a punitive response. The fact that we are where we are 50 years later, 50 years after the birth of the rape reform movement, speaks volumes, I think, about the intractable problems inherent in policing and prosecuting sexual assault.
Well, let's talk about that because you've, in addition to your work analyzing how police process this, you've also written extensively about the anti-rape movement and particularly about the rape reform movement. And I've wrestled with your argument and changed my mind as I've read your article multiple times. At first, I thought, as a public law person in political science, that the lesson was that the failure of law to bring about social change. And I really struggle with that because as someone whose field is public law, I actually believe that law helps shape our norms and that law and discourse really matter. And the legal arena is an important agenda-setting location and important for changing culture, for actually battling rape myths as opposed to just reproducing them. So you demonstrate in your book that, for example, even though the California legislature, like many others, abolished the corroboration requirement, and that decision was reaffirmed multiple times by the California Supreme Court, that the police generally do not arrest or move forward without corroborating evidence. And I think that's what legal scholar Reva Siegel would call preservation through transformation, or Evan Stark labels disguised betrayal. And I now feel pretty cynical after a decade of working on sexual assault on campus. But I still believe that completing the feminist rape reform agenda is worth doing. And I think it is incomplete. It wasn't completely finished and then unsuccessful. It was only sort of partially completed. But you recognize it since 1992, and most recently in 2020, and probably since then, you called the project of rape law reform elusive. So what do you see on the horizon? Which aspects of the rape reform agenda, maybe statute of limitations reform or redefining consent, which do you think are the most promising or most important right now?
Well, first, let me talk a little bit about the takeaways from that 1992 study on the impact of the rape reform movement. I think the first takeaway is the fact that Detroit was the only jurisdiction out of the 6 we studied where the reforms had any effects on reports of rape and case outcomes. And we suggest this in the book. That the criminal justice system can only be affected by the kind of dramatic, comprehensive changes that were enacted in Michigan. The Michigan reform was broader than those adapted in the other 5 jurisdictions we studied. It also was accomplished in one major revision of the state statutes. And so we suggested that the comprehensive reform package in Michigan may have sent a strong and unambiguous message to decision makers about the need for change. The laws enacted in Michigan, in other words, were more than a symbolic response to a vocal constituency clamoring for change. But even in Detroit, the impact of the reforms was pretty limited. I think a second takeaway concerns the remarkable capacity of the criminal legal system to circumvent legal and policy changes that decision makers may believe are unnecessary or counterproductive. We found, like many others who studied reforms directed at the court system, that the rape law reforms placed few constraints on the tremendous discretion exercised by decision makers in the criminal legal system, and especially police and prosecutors. As an illustration for the Rape Reform Project, we interviewed judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys in the 6 jurisdictions included in our study. And as part of the interview, we presented them with a series of vignettes describing situations in which defense attorneys wanted to introduce evidence of the victim's prior sexual behavior. And we asked them whether the evidence should be admitted and whether it would be admitted in their jurisdiction. So I was interviewing a judge in Chicago, which had a very restrictive rape shield law that only allowed the introduction of evidence of the victim's prior sexual history if it included or if it related to behavior or conduct between the victim and that defendant. And so the judge that I was interviewing said that each of the various types of evidence should be admitted and would be admitted. And when I pointed out that the Illinois law would preclude all but one of those 6 types of evidence, the judge said, without missing a beat, well, the law's the law, but fair is fair. You know, clearly the passage of a strong rape shield law had not changed this judge's view of the relevance of sexual history evidence. In the end, I'm pretty cynical about the ability of legal reforms to produce the type of change that is necessary to increase reporting and decrease case attrition in sexual assault cases. For example, as you mentioned earlier, there is no corroboration requirement in California. And yet, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office has a formal policy stating that they will not file charges unless there is some type of corroboration of the victim's allegations. When I pressed them on this, one of the leaders of the sexual assault unit in the district attorney's office argued that it was not a legal requirement, but it was a practical requirement. Their explanation notwithstanding, the policy reflects a belief that women will lie about being sexually assaulted, and that corroboration is therefore necessary to protect innocent men from vindictive women. And this harkens back to the statement by Sir Matthew Hale from the 1600s. And he said that rape is an accusation easily to be made and hard to be proved and harder to be defended against by the party accused, though never so innocent. Well, it seems to me that we haven't made much progress in the last 400 years if we're still talking about the need for corroboration of the survivors' allegations.
Yeah, it's hard to take your rape law reforms from someone who's part of burning witches, as Matthew Hale was. So that's not exactly an endorsement of that position. And of course, as we know, it wasn't until 1975 that was officially not required to be the jury instruction in the state of California.
And many other places as well had to read that cautionary instruction.
You identified, I think, in LA that they would refer to it, instead of what Susan Esrich found as a real rape, they would talk about righteous victims.
They use that terminology. This was primarily in the detectives. The prosecutors were more politically correct, but the detectives used the term righteous victims over and over and over again. It was quite startling.
So do you think that we have made any progress on educating people about how these categories, whether they're people who are drinking, people who are sex workers, people who are homeless, people who are disabled, actually just create categories of vulnerability that allow predators to prey on them with impunity? It seems like that's, rapists have figured out that they're not going to be prosecuted if they just choose those people.
Yes, I mean, sex workers, the disabled, mentally ill, those types of very vulnerable victims, you're right, are targeted by rapists. And one of the most chilling comments that I heard during the interviews that we conducted with detectives in Los Angeles was a detective who said very cavalierly, we see a lot of self-victimization.
That's it. Like I was so troubled by that term. It's like they raped themselves. It's such an odd expression.
And when I asked him, and it was a he, when I asked him what he meant, he said, without missing a beat, well, girls who go to bars, drink too much, and make bad choices. This notion that, there are, on the one hand, righteous victims, and then on the other hand, there are these victims, survivors who are somehow responsible for their victimization in some way.
Yeah, it's very troubling. Well, I mean, this is the thing I was going to ask you about next, these righteous subjects. And of course, one of the biggest problems is you identified really how few of the charges that you looked at were strangers. And, that's actually, one of the things that we've been focusing on with the idea of getting the rape kits tested is that it identifies the victim. But of course, in the case, most of the cases that you looked at, they were acquaintances. So they were people who were known to the victim. And also, one of the things that we've learned is that there isn't often a lot of evidence of injury beyond the coercion of the sex. And we know most people don't report immediately. So you did show in some places that the rape reform movement did lead to an increase in reporting. But I think the other thing that you really demonstrate is how much this category of whether they are cooperative with the police is an artifact of the behavior of the police themselves. So one thing in particular I think that struck me about the book was that you said oftentimes people who are maybe less skilled as police officers might be on the desk, and they're going to be the first one people report to, and they may be the least sympathetic towards the people. And the folks who might have the least amount of training will be the patrol officers who will be the first person to interview that person. And so by the time they actually get to a detective or then are brought into a prosecutor to see if there's going to be an arrest, they've already had a whole number of people who may be hostile to them, who don't believe them. And so their willingness to cooperate is constructed by the police themselves. And then their unwillingness to cooperate is seen as evidence that it never happened in the first place, and that just reinforces the view that women lie. So how do we break that vicious cycle of re-victimizing victims?
That's an excellent question, and I'm not sure I have the the definitive answer to that question. But I think training is important. I don't think it's the answer to all of the problems that we've identified with sexual assault case processing, but I think it is important. And detectives who are trained in victim-centered, trauma-informed interviewing and investigating, I think they do a better job. They have fewer they're better able to establish rapport with victims, and they understand that inconsistencies are normal. Inconsistencies in telling the stories are normal as a result of trauma, and so on. I think that, for example, the End Violence Against Women and their Start by Believing campaign is important, and is having an impact in that they focus on best practices in investigations, best practices in interviewing, and how to handle cases that do make it to court. They've put out some really excellent training materials on best practices in these various aspects of sexual assault case processing. And, I think it's chipping away at some of these biases and prejudices that prevent so many cases from ever making it into the court system.
I think one of the things, too, about End Violence Against Women International that I think strikes me as likely to be particularly effective is having police train other police, and being heard in a way that they can understand as somehow not hostile to police as a whole category, and that was one of the things too that you documented that I thought would really merit more study, and perhaps people have studied that, is just you said the police that were most effective working with victim advocates were also the most effective at developing rapport, at collecting evidence, and that sort of thing. So it's really that sort of partnership, that kind of team effort in tandem. But I do, I always do worry. I remember it struck me when there was that horrible case a long time ago in the Navy where the sailors had chained a woman sailor to a urinal, and they were going to do education. And it just seemed to me, problem definition 101 from public policy is like, what is it that you think is the problem that education is the answer to? And, education can only, in my view, be one part of the answer if there's that much, hatred of one's peers. And, how do you, change that all the way up the chain of command? It's just a huge challenge. But can I ask you about that? Because you've worked also not just with the police, but you've worked with the Department of Defense. In 2023, the Department of Defense changed the way the military handled prosecution of sexual assault cases, with independent lawyers and the offices of special trial counsel now handling these cases instead of the military commanders, which was a very hard-fought reform. And can you talk a little bit more about your experience with the Defense Advisory Board and the other work that you've done most recently?
Sure. Let me preface it by saying that, I was appointed to the Department of Defense Advisory Board on Investigation, Prosecution, and Defense of Sexual Assault in the Armed Forces, a long title known as the DAC IPAD, in 2016. And we spent basically 9 years working on issues related to sexual assault in the armed forces. In 2025, February of 2025, the DAC IPAD was suspended, and we were all dismissed from our positions. So there were 16 of us who were serving on the advisory board. Apparently, President Trump and Secretary of Defense Hegseth did not think that it was important to continue to work on these issues of sexual assault in the armed forces, even though we know it is a huge problem. So the DAC IPAD is no more. Our goal was to actually evaluate the impact of changing from having the commanders make the decision to prefer charges to having it done by the Office of the Special Trial Counsel. I think that the change has enormous potential to change the way the military approaches sexual assault. I don't know that, now that the DAC IPAD has been disbanded, I don't know that there's any other group that is looking at doing an evaluation of the impact of the change. And so, I don't think we're going to have any real clarification of that anytime soon. I've recently just been working on a National Academy of Sciences panel that's looking at problems associated with sexual assault at sea. That is sexual assault that occurs when U.S. Coast Guard vessels, cutters and vessels are underway and a sexual assault takes place. And how do you get the medical exam done? How do you, preserve evidence and, all of the problems that are inherent in that. And we should have a report out, I think, in the next 6 months or so. But so, apparently, in the current political climate, focusing on sexual assault.
It's so discouraging because I know I talked to the people who were in charge of the sexual assault for the southern region, and they were doing the EAAA, the Empowerment Self-Defense for all enlisted women in the military, as an effective strategy. And I remember way back in 2012, David Lisak saying, the military is at least trying to figure it out, which puts it ahead of, for example, many institutions of higher education or other things, is they may not be effective in stopping it, but they're at least recognizing that it's a problem that they have to address. And so there were a lot of people, working on it. So that's especially discouraging. I mean, I think this is the thing about the training and education, is that you can't just be one and done. It's not like that culture change necessarily shifts onto the new folks. It seems like every new group has to learn all the lessons all over again, almost as if from scratch.
The military and college campuses have done is, focus on prevention. And perhaps that is, a better solution than looking at legal accountability. I don't know. I mean, I think prevention is important. And we know that some of the prevention programs like bystander education and things like that they do have an effect.
Yeah, I see accountability as one part of prevention, not just if you have a serial rapist, that's one way to have prevention, but also as part of kind of culture change. And that's what I thought was so interesting. It seems to me that the people you interviewed in LA recognize that. They sort of said, well, even if the person isn't convicted, if there was probable cause and they're arrested, then the next time they're arrested, it sends a different message, or even it may have a chilling effect, on the person. Even if they get off, they may think they got close, or maybe they think they got away with it. I don't know. But it's possible that it had some sort of deterrent effect or effect on other people who know about it, just to think you can't do it with impunity. So it always seemed to me that those things were connected, even though I do accept that the skill set that's involved, for example, on campus, I've been persuaded by people like Charlene Sen and others that, doing prevention is very different than doing accountability work, and you can't expect people to do exactly the same, and we need very different kinds of approaches for both.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that, many of the women who were interviewed by Congress who were in the Coast Guard, which is what sparked this study, they talked about the complete lack of accountability of those for those who assaulted them. That they were told basically that you can't ruin a good man's career, and basically nothing happened. And so, they were very frustrated that, they made a report, they took the steps that were necessary to get the case moving through the system, and yet nothing happened.
Right. I mean, it's the same on campus and elsewhere.
Yeah. So hopefully this new Office of Special Trial Counsel, which takes the decision out of the hands of the commanders and puts it in the hands of a specially trained prosecutorial unit, will have an effect. Time will tell.
So who do you think is moving us forward then, if the military has just been stopped in its track? Are there other places out there that you see hopeful signs of progress?
Oh boy. As I said, I'm kind of a cynic about this, but I do think that there are some positive signs. Things that have happened that have had a positive effect, and one of those was the our study on processing of sexual assault cases in Los Angeles brought to light, I think for the first time, the way that police were using the exceptional clearance to kind of sweep these problematic cases under the rug.
And undercount them.
Yes, and undercount them, absolutely. And, what we discovered in LA and we would have discovered this if we hadn't done all of these interviews. If we had just collected the quantitative data, but not gotten the qualitative data from the people who were making these decisions. But, what we discovered is that if the police had probable cause to make an arrest, but there were some sort of problems with the case, they would take it to the district attorney for what we called a pre-arrest filing decision. And this is one of the things that the district attorney in Los Angeles strenuously objected to. But they would take it to the district attorney and say, is this a case that you'd likely file? And if the prosecutor said no, and here are some of the problems with this case, even though the police had probable cause to make an arrest, they wouldn't make the arrest. And so, as I said, they were essentially ceding their power to make an arrest in these cases to the prosecutors. And so one of the things that came out of our study is that ProPublica turned its attention to this whole issue of exceptional clearances. They interviewed me, they interviewed Becky Campbell, they interviewed some other people, and they really exposed the fact that police departments all across the United States were undercounting. They were actually hiding sexual assaults using this exceptional clearance category, because if cases were exceptionally cleared, they were just reported as cleared by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the Uniform Crime Reports. So in other words, cases that were exceptionally cleared were combined with cases that resulted in an arrest in a cleared category. And so one could look at those figures and say, for example, in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department cleared 83% of their cases. And you say, oh my gosh, that's amazing. They
unless half of them were cleared by doing nothing.
56% of them were cleared by exceptional means.
Oh my God.
So ProPublica really brought this to the forefront, and many police departments instigated their own investigations about these exceptional clearances and how they were being used inappropriately to sweep these so-called problematic cases under the rug and just concentrate on as Susan Estrich would say, the real rapes. And so I think that was one positive thing that came out of our research, is that it did focus attention on this, on the problematic nature of exceptional clearances. But I think that there are other issues that we know very little about. For example, you mentioned victim cooperation. And in our research in Los Angeles, we found that victim cooperation consistently affected whether the police would make an arrest and whether the prosecutor would file charges. It was the only variable included in our multivariate models that affected every aspect of case processing. But the question is, what causes victims to refuse to cooperate? They make a report, they begin to cooperate with the investigation of the case, and then at some point they decide that they don't want to cooperate any longer. My speculation is that what happens is that they get subtle, or maybe not so subtle, signals from police and prosecutors that this is a bad case, it has problems, you're going to be torn apart if you testify against the defendant, and that they decide, this is not worth it for me. This is not in my best interest to pursue this case. But we don't know that. We don't know what leads victims to decide after making a report that they no longer want to pursue prosecution. And so I think that's an avenue that we could have it's a legitimate avenue for research, but it would involve interviewing survivors. And I think that has some real um, IRB implications in terms of protection of human subjects. It would probably be difficult to get a private.
Well, we do know. I mean, our guest 2 times ago, when the police came in, there was a dog barking, and the police officer said to her, just like a woman can never shut its mouth. And then the detective, said, stop bothering me. If I know something, I'll tell you. So those are not very subtle cues about your value. I mean, we've heard that, and that sort of testimony was in the documentary that you were a part of, the I Am Evidence, right? The people being told to leave them alone and stop pestering them, and having to go through all sorts of wild connections just to try to get somebody to investigate their case or do something about it. It was really discouraging. Really discouraging.
Same thing with the testimony of the women in the Coast Guard, where they were told, if you pursue this, you're going to ruin a good man's career.
So you've been a feminist criminologist for quite a while, and I'm wondering what you're thinking about the recent arguments about some that are very critical of the violence against women movement as what Nancy Witter would call with their frenemies, as being feminists were too allied with the criminal justice system and in punitive solutions. What are your views on this so-called carceral feminism?
Well, if you look back to the rape reform movement and how it got started, it really was a case of strange bedfellows, because you had women's groups like the National Organization of Women, and then you also had those who were advocating for rape reform based on arguments about crime control. And so I think it was an uneasy alliance. But nonetheless, I think that one of the motivating factors of the movement was to treat sexual assault as a crime of violence, and to shift the focus of the case from the reputation, the behavior of the survivor, to the criminal behavior of the perpetrator. Like the carceral feminists, I don't believe that the solution to the problem of sexual violence is harsh punishment. I think it's part of the solution to the problem, a punitive response, holding perpetrators accountable. But I also think that prevention has a role to play in this process as well.
Right. Thanks. I'm almost out of time here, but I wanted to ask you, one of the things that troubles me, but also seems to me an opportunity, is it seems like I wonder what the number of accusers it takes for someone to be considered likely to be guilty. How many words of a woman count against one man. And so we've had these examples where serial perpetrators, victims, have really mobilized together to change the law, and seem to have quite a bit, ultimately, not easily, not early on, but ultimately seem to have an effect. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the sort of the Weinstein, the Cosby, and the Epstein victims to band together to bring about rape reform.
I think that, their bravery in doing so has brought renewed attention to the problem of sexual assault in the United States and around the world. Unfortunately, the results of those cases are not necessarily what we would have wanted, with the overturning Bill Cosby's conviction, and I think Weinstein's conviction was overturned as well. And, I think it's certainly disturbing that we now have a president whose conviction for sexual assault did not dissuade voters for supporting him. Coupled with other allegations from more than 24 women and the infamous Access Hollywood tapes, this suggests that we as a society will tolerate this type of behavior in our leaders, or at least a segment of our society will tolerate this kind of behavior in our leaders. So I think the whole Me Too movement has some promise, but again, I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but I'm not. No, I've been doing this for a long time. This work for a long time, and you referred to my paper on the more things change, the more they stay the same, and it's very disheartening that 50 years of advocacy and 50 years of reform have resulted in so little progress. And I think that's what discourages me. I know my students, I had 2 students this semester who were doing some analysis of the qualitative data from the interviews with the detectives and prosecutors in Los Angeles, and they would come to our meetings just almost in tears at what they were reading in these interviews. They're 19, 20 years old, and they can't quite believe that in 2025, well, this was 2011, but nonetheless, I think if we did this in 2025, we wouldn't find anything very different. But they were so disheartened at the views that were expressed. And, they're just getting started. I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm doubly disheartened by the lack of progress that we've made. I mean, things have changed somewhat, but unfortunately.
I think I liked the example that you gave of the ProPublica, because I think that has been a change in at least some parts, some corners of journalism, and that's where the cumulative effect. I mean, I was remembering that scene from the Spotlight movie where, the journalist said, "Oh, we'd heard these allegations over and over again, but we never thought there was anything to them, until they did." And I think we have more journalists now who, when they believe there's something to them, are less likely to just be shut down by their organizations in some ways. And we have these contradictory facts of the, E. Jean Carroll decision, where a jury did find in exactly the cases that all of your police detectives said we would never take to the DA, right? Or the DA would never have us arrest, and someone was found responsible. However, then, not enough to make people persuaded to vote otherwise necessarily. So there's a lot of contradictory findings. It's very hard to figure out how to make sense of it all and keep things going. But I'm glad you're still going, and I really appreciate you taking this time to talk to me. And I can't wait to see what you do next. And I'll be watching the vacant Defense Department space as another place to be discouraged after having seen some progress and waiting for that next space to crop up for opportunity. So thank you very much for the work that you do, and thank you for talking to me today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure talking with you, Sally.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I owe a debt of gratitude to many who contributed to the second half of Season 2 now that I have moved home to Iowa. Music credit goes to the talented Jerry Lee Kenny on saxophone and to the late Dwight Champagne for his original composition, Surrender. Thanks to all my new friends and colleagues at Amplified in Des Moines, Amner Martinez, Laura Rodriguez, Aki Petavine for production and edging me into video. I would also like to thank the many students in my classes on rape and gender-based violence over the years for all I have learned from them, my rape pen pals, and my newfound community of those working to end sexual violence in Iowa, in particular through the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Lastly, I'd like to thank the many survivors, not just scholars, who disclosed to me as students over the last 37 years, especially those in the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, 13 of whom just received their undergraduate degrees from Tulane University in October, and the Homestead Correctional Institute for Women. Your courage, humor, resilience, and determination to find joy showed me the way.